is the 55th anniversary of the moon landing, the first time humans ever walked on the moon. On 21st of July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin stepped foot on the moon. They landed at Tranquility Base and they hopped off their Eagle lunar lander module while their crewmate Michael Collins orbited the moon in the Columbia Command Module spacecraft. The event is historic for humankind. It is the first ever venture of humans outside of Earth physically, and the major details are printed across textbooks all over the world. We studied these growing up. But there are many other unfamiliar instances to us that the astronauts experienced before, during, and after their flight. Famously, when they reached home, the astronauts had to go through customs and they declared their moon rocks. But there are many other nitty-gritty that went on when they were still on the surface. Here are top 10 fun facts about the moon landing that you might not have known. The moon has a smell. Upon landing, Armstrong described the surface texture as powdery and as the soil clinging to his suit. But after the duo went back into their module and started to take off their spacesuits and helmet, they realized that the lunar soil that was clinging to their suits had a smell. This smell was described by Neil Armstrong as being that of wet ashes and Aldrin as being that of burnt gunpowder in the air. There was so much lunar dust sticking to their suits that they had to sleep with their helmets on inside the lunar module. They actually brought back a bit of soil and scattered it on a surface when they tried to repressure the cabin to see if this soil would start to smoke or smolder. But nothing happened. Other astronauts have described the smell of outer space as well, something similar to metallic and sweet. By the time astronauts reach Earth, the smell disappears due to exposure to air and moisture. The original Wright brothers plane pieces flew to the moon with Neil Armstrong. In 1903, the Wright brothers created history by achieving flight, and this heralded a new era of transport among humans. Armstrong went to the moon a mere 66 years later. During his turn to create history, Armstrong actually carried pieces of wood from the original Wright flyer in his personal kit. These artifacts were taken to moon and back, and now they're on display in museums. There are lunar craters here on Earth. To simulate a lunar landscape for training before the Apollo program, the US Geological Survey teamed up with NASA to blast the Earth and land at Cinder Lake, Arizona, to create craters. They wanted to recreate the exact area where the astronauts would land on the moon. The soil here is already covered with basaltic lava, which is a similar material to the lunar surface. A total of 143 craters were created here to replicate the lunar terrain around the landing site. All Apollo astronauts tested their vehicles and their abilities here, except, incidentally, the Apollo 11 astronauts. The site is still open to tourism, although wind and water and other natural elements have eroded the sharpness of the features here. Disney has also since used this location as a filming set for their moon stories. One small step for whom? It is often reported that upon setting foot on the soil, Armstrong said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." But he later claimed that he actually said an A in between, "That's one small step for a man." This was refuted later. People came up to him and said they could not hear it over recordings, but engineers and linguistics did examine the recordings forensically and concluded that he did say A. So the original quote was, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." It was grammatically correct, and therefore today the quote is often reported with the A in brackets. An almost aborted moon landing. The landing site for Apollo 11 was decided much beforehand, well in advance, and the spacecraft was programmed to fly there. But as the two astronauts inched closer to the surface in their lunar module, they realized that the surface was not clear and was covered with boulders and rocks. They had to immediately navigate manually to find an alternate landing site which they can land on stably. The moon landing probe only had limited fuel, and the duo made it on the ground with just 25 minutes to spare while their fuel alarm was going out. If the fuel had run out, an automatic abort sequence would have kicked in, sending them back to the command module to orbit and aborting the landing entirely. It was later incidentally revealed that the warning itself was faulty. It was caused by fuel sloshing around and touching the sensors, but that was still very, very close. Armstrong's heart rate reportedly reached 150 during the descent, and this was on top of a whole number of alarms and issues that the crew were facing as soon as they began their descent. 5 minutes in, computers started throwing up several unexpected errors and alarms, but all of these were resolved by the time they landed on the moon 30 minutes later. Space infection on Earth. When the 3 astronauts splashed into the ocean, they were given biological isolation garments they had to put on before being assisted into the life raft and then the helicopter. They were rubbed down with antiseptics and disinfectants, and the materials that were used to decontaminate them were purposefully sunk to the seabed. The team flew in a helicopter to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, and they were then promptly moved into a quarantine facility there because medical experts were afraid that they could be carrying germs or unknown pathogens of unknown origin, both from outer space and from the moon. The mobile quarantine facility housed the 3 astronauts, a doctor, and a technician for over 60 hours on the aircraft carrier. Is there poop on the moon? Beginning with Apollo 11, astronauts have left a total of 96 bags of human waste on the moon combined. The team stored their excrement from the 3-day journey in the spacecraft and had to leave the bags of dirty waste and soiled diapers on the lunar surface because they had to reduce weight, and they had to carry back lots and lots of moon rocks. So they discarded their bags of human waste, and those bags are still standing on the moon. In fact, when humans get access to them again, they are expected to become subjects of study for microbes that could or could not have persisted on the surface of the moon. Beyond just their own poop, astronauts have also left many other items on the moon. There are photos and cassettes and recordings in multiple languages. They left behind mementos and artifacts belonging to other astronauts, especially the ones who lost their lives in space missions. There was a Soviet robot that crashed on the moon when the 2 astronauts were still on the surface. The space race in the 60s and 70s was a culmination of the Cold War. Both the Americans and the Soviets were desperate to get to the moon first. The Soviet Union, and today Russia, continued its lunar program, which is robotic landers for the moon as well as orbiters. This program began in the 60s and ran concurrently with Apollo. And Luna 15 was scheduled to land on the moon on the same day as Apollo 11 astronauts. It was orbiting the moon the same time as Columbia was, and it began descending after the astronauts below finished their first moonwalk. There was a distance of over 500 kilometers between the 2 missions. The lander crashed on the moon a few hours before the Apollo 11 astronauts took off from the lunar surface to the orbit. Buzz Aldrin performed the first religious ritual on the moon in secret. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin was an elder in his Presbyterian church at the time of flight, and he performed a Christian communion on the surface of the moon. The ceremony involved observing silence and thanksgiving, and he drank bread and wine in a chalice that was made by his local pastor. Aldrin had to perform the ceremony off air because of a lawsuit. The previous year, the first humans to orbit the moon, the crew of Apollo 8, had read from the book of Genesis during their 9th orbit around the moon, and this led to a group called the American Atheists suing the US government for constitutional violations. This Genesis reading, incidentally, was used at the end of the song History by Michael Jackson. The US flag planted by Apollo 11 is gone. When Armstrong and Aldrin took off from the surface of the moon, Aldrin reported seeing the American flag he planted fall over because of the ignition gases. The flag they planted on the moon was actually quite difficult to push in. It had gone in just about 2 inches, and it was not expected to survive contact with the ground after falling, and exposure to fierce solar radiation and heat. The astronauts were in fact worried that while planting, the flag would in fact fall down live on air, but that didn't happen. Images from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter recently have also confirmed that the Apollo 11 flag no longer stands there, and there is no evidence of it. Although other flags, including Apollo 12's limp flag, is still standing.